The Broken Titan. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Kane International Holdings, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. At 47 years old, Asher Kane stood like a statue at the window of his corner office, his tall frame silhouetted against the city skyline. He was known as one of the most powerful men in the financial world, respected, envied, and feared in equal measure. His perfectly tailored charcoal suit bore not a single wrinkle, though the truth was far less perfect. He had not been home in months. His leather couch tucked against the wall of his office had become his bed, a folded blanket and pillow hidden behind it, a secret only he knew. 4 months had passed since Claire, his wife of nearly 2 decades, had walked out. She had left no explanation, no parting words, just a diamond ring lying cold and glittering on their dining table. To outsiders, Asher had shrugged it off, appearing colder and sharper than ever. But inside, something had broken. He locked himself away in the office towers of his empire, as if walls of glass and steel could protect him from emptiness. "Mr. Kane, your 9 o'clock is here," his assistant Meredith announced softly from the doorway. "Give me 5 minutes," he replied without turning around. When the door closed, he rubbed his tired eyes, staring at the reflection of a man who seemed untouchable but felt hollow. He straightened his tie, slid into his chair, and wore the mask the world expected, the ruthless businessman who never lost, never wept, never faltered. The meeting that followed was the same as the hundreds before it. Numbers, reports, deals. Asher's voice was controlled and steady, but each word felt like another brick in the wall he was building around his heart. His executives filed out with forced smiles, none daring to ask why their CEO's eyes looked lifeless. That night, after the city lights replaced the day, Asher remained in his office. The building grew silent, floors emptied. Even Meredith left after her usual "Good night, Mr. Kane," her voice carrying worry she dared not express. By midnight, the skyscraper belonged only to him, and the cleaning staff who arrived like shadows moving quietly through the halls. Among them was Elena Rivera, a 32-year-old woman with tired eyes but a gentle spirit. She had been working in the building for 6 months, always silent, always careful. She was a single mother, and the night shift was her only option after spending the day with her son Luca. To her, Kane International's tower was not a palace of power, but simply a place to scrub floors and empty bins. She had seen the billionaire in passing, though she doubted he had ever noticed her. That night, however, she did notice him. She paused when she saw his light still glowing. Through the glass walls of his office, she saw him seated at his desk, a man who looked powerful yet strangely defeated. She continued with her work but carried the image in her mind. At 2 in the morning, she pushed her cart toward the executive floor. On a small tray, she carried a thermos of tea she always brewed at home. It was an herbal blend her grandmother used to make, chamomile, lemongrass, and a hint of mint. It calmed her nerves after long nights, and tonight something told her the man in the corner office needed it more than she did. She set the steaming cup quietly on his desk while he dozed in the chair, head tilted back. She did not wait for thanks. She simply whispered, "For you," and slipped out. When Asher stirred minutes later, he frowned at the sight of the cup. Suspicion came first. Was this some trick? A gesture of pity? He considered sweeping it into the trash. But then, exhaustion broke his pride. He lifted the cup, inhaled its calming scent, and took a small sip. Warmth spread through his chest. It was the first time in months that something other than coffee or whiskey touched his lips at night. He said nothing. But the next night, another cup appeared. And the night after that. At first he ignored it. Then he began waiting for it. By the 4th week, he found himself wondering not about stock markets or acquisitions, but about the invisible person who left him this quiet kindness. One evening, unable to resist, he asked Meredith, "Who cleans this floor at night?" She looked surprised. "A woman named Elena Rivera, I believe. She's quiet, single mother, works hard." "Why?" "No reason," he muttered, hiding the curiosity in his voice. But the truth was, the nightly tea had become the only thing anchoring him. He began to notice its subtleties. Some nights it was slightly sweeter, some nights stronger. Whoever she was deliberate. And though she left no words, her small act spoke louder than the silence that had filled his life since Claire left. The empire of Kane International still looked the same from the outside, imposing, vast, and untouchable. But within the walls of the top floor, a crack had appeared in the armor of its ruler, and it had begun not with power, not with wealth, but with a single cup of tea left by hands that trembled with exhaustion, yet still found the strength to give. Asher Kane, the man who thought he had everything, was about to discover that the simplest gestures could stir a heart long buried beneath marble, glass, and pride. The silent visitor. The nights had become a strange rhythm for Asher Kane. Each evening the building would empty, the chatter of assistants and analysts fading into silence, leaving only the hum of the city outside his glass fortress. He would sit alone at his desk, buried beneath reports and contracts, pretending to himself that the endless work was what kept him tethered. Yet what he waited for, though he would never admit it aloud, was far simpler. The soft clink of porcelain against polished walls. The faint scent of chamomile and mint drifting across the room. The quiet reminder that someone, unseen, had thought of him. The cup of tea had become his unspoken companion. At first it had unsettled him. How dare anyone presume he needed comfort? Asher Kane was a man who built empires, who faced down competitors without flinching, who could dismantle fortunes with a single phone call. Vulnerability had no place in his world. And yet he found himself surrendering to this ritual. On nights when fatigue threatened to drag him under, he would cradle the warm cup in both hands, breathing in the steam before drinking slowly, almost reverently. It calmed the storm inside him in a way nothing else could. But the mystery gnawed at him. Who was she? Meredith had given him a name, Elena Rivera, but nothing more. He pictured her faceless as she moved through the halls at night, a shadow in uniform, unseen and unnoticed, except for this one act that defied invisibility. It was absurd that the head of Kane International Holdings, a man accustomed to knowing every player on the board, could not solve this riddle. And yet, part of him resisted finding out too soon. The unknown, he realized, had a strange comfort of its own. Still, curiosity has a way of creeping into even the most guarded minds. One night, after yet another long day that ended in an empty office and a cold silence, he decided to stay awake, waiting. He left the lights low, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes as if sleeping. He heard the faint squeak of wheels, the cleaning cart. Soft footsteps padded across the marble floor, then the clink of porcelain against his desk. He kept his breathing steady, feigning slumber, until the footsteps retreated. But just before she left, he heard the faintest whisper, "I hope this helps." The words were not meant for him to hear, but they pierced deeper than any boardroom insult or investor's doubt. He opened his eyes and saw the steam curling from the cup. For a long moment, he stared at the doorway through which she had disappeared. No one had spoken to him like that in months, not with genuine care, not without expectation. The following night, he could no longer contain his curiosity. When the door creaked open and the soft footsteps approached, he lifted his head and said quietly, "Why do you keep doing this?" The woman froze. She had a slender frame, dark hair tied back, a plain uniform that bore the marks of long hours. Her eyes widened at the sight of him awake, watching. She looked ready to retreat. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to disturb you." She placed the cup down quickly, almost as if it were a crime, and turned to go. "Wait," Asher said, his voice low but firm. Years of commanding boardrooms carried weight in his tone, but this time it held something else, an edge of vulnerability. "I asked why. No one does anything for me without a reason. So tell me why." Elena hesitated at the doorway, gripping her cleaning cloth tightly. Her heart pounded, but something in his expression stopped her from fleeing. He did not look like the untouchable billionaire she had glimpsed in passing, the man whispered about in fearful tones by employees. He looked tired, human. She drew a slow breath before answering. "Because you look like you need it." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. She slipped out before he could respond, leaving him staring at the steam rising from the cup. Because you look like you need it. Simple, unadorned. And yet, it was the first truth he had heard in months. Asher did not know what to make of it. Part of him bristled. Was he so visibly broken that even a cleaner could see his weakness? Another part, deeper and more honest, felt something stir. Gratitude. He sipped the tea slowly that night, not for the flavor, but for the intention behind it. For the first time since Claire's departure, he did not feel entirely invisible. Over the next week, a tentative pattern emerged. Elena still left the tea without ceremony, but now Asher sometimes stayed awake, watching her place it down. He did not always speak, but when he did, the exchanges were brief and awkward. "What's in it?" he asked one night. "Chamomile, lemongrass, mint. My grandmother's recipe," she replied softly. Another time he remarked, "You don't have to." She gave a small shrug and said, "Maybe not, but I want to." These were not conversations by ordinary standards, but to Asher, who had built walls higher than the skyscrapers he owned, they were monumental. It startled him how much he began to anticipate them. The silence of the office no longer felt like a prison. It was becoming something else. A place where a quiet visitor left behind not just tea, but a reminder that he was still human. Meanwhile, Elena found herself conflicted. She had never intended for this simple gesture to become noticed. She only wanted to ease what she saw in his eyes, the heaviness of someone carrying too much. But now he was watching her, speaking to her, drawing her into a space she had no business entering. He was a billionaire, and she was a cleaner struggling to make ends meet. Their worlds were not just different, they were galaxies apart. And yet every time she saw the faintest softening in his expression, she could not stop herself from returning with the tea. One night, as a storm raged outside, lightning flashing against the glass walls of the tower, Asher asked more than usual, "You work here every night?" "Yes," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Do you ever sleep?" A small smile touched her lips, though it carried no joy. "Not much. I have a son. Daytimes are his. Nights belong to this building." The scene shows a modern, elegant office interior at night. A well-dressed man in a white shirt and gray trousers is seated in a sleek chair, looking up with a slightly surprised expression. Beside him, a young black woman in a neat gray and white maid uniform is leaning forward, carefully placing a cup of coffee on a small round table. She wears white gloves, and her posture conveys attentiveness and professionalism. The office background is warmly lit with modern lamps, dark curtains, and large windows revealing a cityscape at night. The atmosphere feels dramatic and intense, as if both characters are caught in an important unspoken moment. Cracks in the armor. The weeks that followed moved slowly, yet something in Asher's world had begun to change. To the outside eye, Kane International Holdings still operated like an unstoppable machine. Deals were struck, partnerships secured, and competitors crushed with the precision of a master tactician. Shareholders praised Asher's discipline, the press wrote of his resilience after the divorce, and employees continued to speak of him with hushed awe, as if he were not a man at all, but an unshakable monument. But beneath the armor of his reputation, small cracks were forming, delicate, almost invisible fractures created not by enemies or markets, but by something as soft and unassuming as a cup of tea and the quiet presence of a woman who asked for nothing in return. Their interactions remained brief, but each one carved itself into his thoughts. He found himself listening more closely when she spoke, watching for the way her hands trembled slightly when she set the cup down, noticing the faint shadows under her eyes that told of sleepless days and long nights. She spoke little of herself, but the small details she let slip built an image that he could not ignore. A son, long hours, strength that did not shout but endured. One evening, as the city outside glittered like 1,000 diamonds against the night sky, Asher finally asked a question that had lingered in his mind. "What is his name?" Elena paused, startled by the suddenness of it. She looked at him as though weighing whether to answer. "Luca," she said at last, her voice quiet but steady. "He's 8. Loves drawing airplanes. Thinks one day he'll build one big enough to fly to the stars." Asher leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment he saw not the skyline but a boy's crayon sketches, colorful and clumsy, filled with impossible dreams. He remembered being a boy himself long before Kane International, before the suits and the boardrooms. He remembered sketching bridges on scraps of paper, dreaming of building things that connected people. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped building bridges and had instead built walls. Airplanes, he said finally, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Not a bad dream. The conversation ended there as it always did, with Elena slipping away into the halls and Asher left alone with his thoughts. But the name, Luca, stayed with him. That night, when he lay on the couch with the blanket pulled over him, he found himself imagining the boy. A small figure bent over a piece of paper, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth as he drew. Innocence, determination, hope. The things Asher had once had but lost somewhere along the climb to power. The next night, he noticed something unusual. As Elena set the cup on his desk, a folded piece of paper slipped from her pocket and landed on the floor. She bent quickly to retrieve it, but not before Asher caught a glimpse of bright colors and the unmistakable shape of an airplane drawn in thick crayon strokes. "May I?" he asked, surprising them both. Elena hesitated, then handed it over reluctantly. "It's Luca's. He insists on giving me one every day. I keep them with me so I don't lose them." Asher unfolded the drawing carefully as if it were made of glass. It showed a large plane with wings far too big, soaring through a sky filled with suns and stars. At the bottom, in a child's uneven letters, was scrawled, "For Mama, for the sky." For a long moment, Asher could not speak. Something in his chest tightened painfully, and for the first time in months, he had to look away to steady himself. "He's talented," he said at last, his voice rougher than he intended. Elena smiled softly, pride flickering across her tired features. "He just loves to dream. Maybe too much. The world can be hard on dreamers." Asher handed the paper back, but the image remained etched in his mind. When she left, he found himself staring at the skyline again, but it looked different now. Less like a fortress of steel and more like a canvas waiting for new lines to be drawn. In the days that followed, Asher noticed other changes within himself. Meetings that once felt suffocating now seemed less important compared to the quiet moments at night. He found himself softening just slightly when employees made mistakes. Meredith noticed it first. "You didn't snap at Richards this morning," she remarked cautiously after a junior analyst fumbled his presentation. Asher shrugged, pretending indifference, but inside he knew why. Richards had reminded him of Luca, eager, uncertain, trying his best to win, despite the odds. At night, the conversations with Elena grew a little longer. Never too much, she was careful not to overstep, but enough to chip away at his walls. She told him how she worked 2 jobs, how her parents had passed away years ago, how she had once dreamed of studying medicine, but had given it up when life demanded survival instead. She spoke of Luca with love that filled every word, even when exhaustion dulled her tone. Asher listened, truly listened, and each story cut through the silence that had bound him since Claire left. He realized with a mix of awe and unease that Elena spoke with a kind of honesty he had not encountered in years. She did not flatter him, did not fear him, did not expect anything from him. She was simply herself, and that more than anything unsettled him. One evening, when she finished telling him about Luca's obsession with folding paper airplanes and throwing them from their tiny apartment balcony, Asher asked quietly, "Do you ever wish you had chosen differently?" Elena looked at him, her gaze steady. "Of course. But wishing doesn't put food on the table. I don't have the luxury of regrets, Mr. Kane. I just keep moving forward. For him." Her words struck him like a blow. He, the man who had everything, had spent months drowning in regrets, of Claire, of choices made, of words left unsaid. And here was a woman with so little, yet she carried herself with strength he could barely comprehend. For the first time, he wondered if true wealth was not counted in dollars but in resilience, in the ability to keep moving forward even when the world gave you every reason to collapse. That night, when Elena left and the building returned to silence, Asher sat alone at his desk, the untouched reports before him. He stared at his reflection in the glass wall, the image of a man who had conquered industries yet had been undone by loneliness. And for the first time, he allowed himself to admit the truth. He did not want to be alone anymore. The cracks in his armor were widening, he could feel it, and though it frightened him, it also gave him something he had long forgotten: hope. The storm outside, the calm inside. The winter winds howled against the glass walls of Kane International's tower, rattling faintly as if even the building itself felt the weight of the storm outside. Inside the boardrooms of power, the storm was no less fierce. For the first time in years, Kane International was facing a crisis not of Asher's making, but one that could still tear apart everything he had built. A regulatory probe into one of their overseas acquisitions had drawn headlines, and the whispers in the financial press spread like wildfire. Analysts speculated whether the empire was beginning to crumble, competitors circled like sharks, and shareholders demanded answers. For most men, such pressure would have been unbearable. For Asher Kane, the man the world believed to be unbreakable, it was another battlefield. Yet deep down, even he felt the cracks widening. The meeting stretched into endless hours, men and women around the table speaking in urgent tones, their voices layering over one another like waves crashing against rocks. Asher sat at the head of the table, still in control, still giving orders with precision, but those closest to him noticed the slight strain in his voice. The sleepless nights on the office couch, the lingering grief of Claire's departure, and the quiet questions Elena had awakened inside him, they all collided with the weight of the company's turmoil. When the boardroom finally emptied, leaving only silence and the storm's echo against the windows, Asher found himself slumped back in his chair, his hands pressed hard against his temples. He had built his life on control, every deal calculated, every risk measured, every weakness hidden. But control was slipping, and the thought of failure weighed at him in a way he could not admit to anyone, not his executives, not even Meredith, who had served him faithfully for years. Alone in the vast office, surrounded by polished marble and glass, he felt a loneliness sharper than ever. Power had insulated him, but insulation was not the same as comfort. It was in that moment, when the storm outside thundered loudest, that the door creaked open. Elena stepped inside, her uniform damp from the rain she had walked through on her way to work. She pushed her cart quietly, expecting to go unnoticed as always. But when she saw him sitting there, shoulders heavy, eyes shadowed, something stopped her. Normally, she would set the cup of tea down in silence and retreat. Tonight, however, she hesitated. Asher looked up, startled by her stillness. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the billionaire and the cleaner, worlds apart yet bound by an invisible thread. Finally, she placed the cup on his desk, but instead of leaving, she drew out a chair and sat across from him. Her movements were unhurried, steady, as though she had decided the silence needed to be broken not with words, but with presence. "You're not yourself," she said softly, not as a question, but as a quiet truth. Asher almost laughed at the simplicity of it. Not himself. He was still Asher Kane, the empire builder, the ruthless negotiator, the man whose name commanded entire industries. And yet, as he looked into her calm, unflinching gaze, he realized how hollow those titles had become. He didn't reply at first. Instead, he picked up the tea, letting the steam rise against his face, and drank slowly. The warmth spread through him, not enough to erase the storm, but enough to steady the shaking inside. "Everything I've built is at risk," he said at last, his voice low. "Years of work, decades. I don't even know who to trust anymore." Elena did not flinch. She did not offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She simply folded her hands in her lap and said, "Then fight for it, but don't let it consume you. Empires can be rebuilt. People cannot." Her words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples through the silence. No one spoke to him like that. Not investors, not advisors, not even Claire had dared to cut through his armor so directly. Yet Elena did, not with arrogance or challenge, but with a quiet strength that seemed to come from someone who had endured storms of her own. Asher leaned back, studying her. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," she admitted, her eyes softening. "But you already know the hard part, surviving. The rest is just choosing how." For a long while they said nothing more. The storm outside raged on, wind lashing against the tower, thunder rolling across the city. But in that office, there was an unusual calm. Asher, who had spent months drowning in his solitude, found himself sharing the silence with someone who did not demand anything of him. Elena did not try to solve his problems, did not press for details, did not pretend to understand the complexities of billion-dollar empires. She simply sat there, her presence enough to remind him that he was not as alone as he believed. When she finally rose to leave, Asher spoke before she reached the door. "Thank you." The words were quiet, but for him they carried a weight greater than any contract he had ever signed. Elena turned, her expression unreadable, then gave a small nod. "Good night, Mr. Kane." After she left, Asher sat staring at the closed door. He realized that the storm outside no longer felt quite so overwhelming. He would face the regulators, the shareholders, the vultures circling his empire, but he would not face them hollow. The tea still warmed his hands, and the memory of her steady gaze lingered in his mind. That night, for the first time since Claire's departure, Asher did not fall asleep on the couch, drowning in regret. He slept with a strange sense of calm, as though the fortress of glass around him no longer stood quite so empty. The child's gift, the days stretched into weeks, and though the storm surrounding Kane International's scandal had not fully passed, Asher Kane found himself strangely steadier. There were still phone calls from restless shareholders, still headlines in the financial papers speculating on his downfall, still late-night strategy sessions that clawed at his stamina. Yet every evening when the building emptied and silence settled over the marble floors, he waited, not for sleep, not for another report, but for the sound of footsteps that always came, for the soft presence of Elena Rivera, who carried with her not only a cup of tea but a calm that seemed impossible in the chaos of his world. It was on one of those evenings, as rain tapped against the glass like a gentle metronome, that something happened to pierce the fragile rhythm they had built. Elena arrived later than usual, her hair damp from the misty night air. She placed the tea on his desk as she always did, but there was a faint nervousness in her eyes. Before Asher could ask, he heard it, a sound out of place in the quiet halls of Kane International, the small, curious laugh of a child. Elena froze. Asher stood slowly from his chair, his height casting a long shadow across the office. "Someone's here," he said. Before she could stop him, a small boy peeked around the doorway. His hair was dark and a little untidy, his cheeks still carrying the roundness of childhood, and in his hand was a folded piece of paper he seemed to guard like treasure. When his eyes met Asher's, they widened, not with fear, but with the kind of unfiltered curiosity only a child possesses. Elena's voice came quickly, tinged with both apology and concern. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Kane. This is Luca. My sitter canceled tonight and I couldn't leave him alone. I told him to stay quiet in the supply room, but..." The boy stepped out fully before she could finish, his small sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. He walked up to the imposing figure of Asher Kane, billionaire and empire builder, without hesitation. Extending the paper in his hand, he said simply, "For you." Asher blinked, momentarily disarmed. He took the paper, unfolding it carefully. Inside was a drawing, another airplane, its wings stretched wide, soaring high above a city that looked suspiciously like the skyline outside Asher's own windows. In the corner, in uneven letters, the boy had written, "Fly higher." For a moment, Asher could not speak. He looked down at the boy, who was staring up at him with an earnest expression that reminded him of something long buried, of his own youth, when dreams were drawn on scraps of paper instead of measured in billions. The drawing was crude, imperfect, yet it carried a weight that no contract or market valuation ever had. "This is yours?" Asher asked quietly. Luca nodded proudly. "I make airplanes. Mama says one day I'll fly for real, but you look like you need one now." The words were simple, innocent, yet they struck with the force of truth. Asher felt his throat tighten. He looked over at Elena, who stood nervously by the door, unsure if she had crossed a line she could not retreat from. Her face showed both embarrassment and a protective instinct for her son, as though she expected Asher to dismiss them, to remind them of their place. But instead, something wholly unexpected happened. Asher smiled. It was faint, hesitant, as though the muscles had forgotten how, but it was there. He crouched slightly so he was closer to the boy's level. Hold him. Hang up the paper. You think I need this? Yes, Lucas said firmly. Everyone needs something to play with, even grown-ups. A laugh escaped Asher's chest, quiet but genuine. It startled even him. He had not laughed like that in months, maybe longer. He reached out and ruffled the boy's hair gently, an action so foreign to him it felt almost surreal. Thank you, Luca, he said softly. I'll keep it. The boy grinned, satisfied, before running back to his mother's side. Elena's eyes were wide with surprise at Asher's reaction. She had expected coldness, perhaps even anger. But what she saw instead was a man momentarily unburdened, softened by a child's innocence. That night, after they left, Asher sat at his desk staring at the drawing. He placed it carefully in the top drawer, alongside pens and papers worth far more in the eyes of the world, but none of them had ever carried this kind of meaning. As he lay on the couch later, he found himself thinking not of board meetings or scandals, but of the boy's words. Everyone needs something to play with. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps somewhere along the climb, he had forgotten how. The following evenings when Elena came, Asher asked small questions about Luca. What he liked to eat, what games he played, what dreams filled his head. Elena answered with quiet pride, painting a picture of a boy who carried light into every room despite the weight of their modest life. The more Asher listened, the more he realized how much he had lost in his pursuit of greatness, not money or power, but the simplicity of joy, the wonder of dreaming without fear. One evening, Meredith entered his office in the morning and noticed something unusual pinned to the inside of the bookshelf behind his desk. What's this? She asked, adjusting her glasses. Asher glanced over. It was Luca's airplane drawing taped carefully to the wood. He straightened him, leaned his tie and said evenly, motivation. Meredith raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Yet in her mind, she noted how different her employer was becoming. The man who once decorated his walls only with certificates, accolades, and expensive art had made space for a child's crayon sketch. The Ice King was thawing, and she had a feeling she knew whose warmth was responsible. For Asher, the gift had become more than paper. It was a reminder that beyond the empire of glass and steel, there existed a world where dreams could still be drawn with crayons and given away freely, a world where kindness asked for nothing, where even a billionaire could be reminded of his humanity by the small hand of a child. The child's gift had cracked something deeper than even Elena's tea, and though Asher did not yet know where this path would lead, he knew one thing for certain. He no longer wanted to walk it alone. The man who came back. In the weeks after Luca's unexpected visit, subtle but undeniable changes began to ripple through the life of Asher Kane. The man who had once lived only for numbers, deals, and conquests now found himself measuring time differently, not only by the rise and fall of stocks or the completion of contracts, but by the quiet, ordinary rhythms of human connection. His nights were no longer defined by empty solitude, but by the anticipation of a cup of tea placed gently on his desk. His mornings no longer began with a cold stare in the mirror, but with the faint memory of a child's drawing taped inside his bookshelf. It was as if the brittle armor he had forged over decades was softening, one crack at a time, and through those cracks, light was seeping in. Meredith noticed first. She had served Asher long enough to know every edge of his temperament, every storm behind his controlled expression. Yet now, in meetings, she saw something she had not witnessed in years: patience. When a junior associate, Stu, ambled nervously through a presentation, Asher did not snap or cut him down with sharp words. Instead, he leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said calmly, "Take a breath. Try again." The entire room had gone still, stunned at the mercy of a man whose reputation had been built on ruthless efficiency. The analysts whispered in corridors, "He's different lately." Did you see the way he actually listened? The Ice King smiled. At first they thought it might be a tactic, some calculated performance to disarm critics, but as days turned to weeks, it became clear. This was no act. Something within Asher Kane had shifted, and the world around him was beginning to feel it. Even outside the polished halls of Kane International, the change showed. At charity galas where once he appeared as a stiff figure merely fulfilling obligations, he now lingered, asked questions, and even laughed when speaking with young entrepreneurs eager to share their ideas. At one such event, a journalist remarked in her column, "It seems the man of marble has remembered how to be flesh and blood." Investors were puzzled, rivals wary, but those closest to him, those who worked late in his shadow, began to see the truth. Elena noticed too, though she tried not to. She still moved through the halls at night with her cart, still placed the cup of tea on his desk, still exchanged only a few quiet words before retreating. Yet in those few moments she saw the difference. His eyes no longer carried the same bleak emptiness. They held a depth, a quiet searching, as though he were beginning to see the world again rather than simply endure it. Sometimes when their hands brushed briefly as she set the cup down, she caught something in his gaze she could not name, a gentleness that unsettled her as much as it warmed her. One evening as she prepared to leave, Asher spoke more than usual. "You know, River, I've been thinking." Elena froze slightly at the use of her surname. "Yes, sir." He leaned back, swirling the tea in his hand. "All these years, I thought power was about control, about never showing weakness, never bending, never letting anyone see you bleed. But I was wrong. The real strength, I think, is in surviving when you have every reason to break and still finding a way to give. You taught me that." She looked at him, startled. "I didn't teach you anything. I only brought you tea." But Asher shook his head. "No, you brought more than that. You brought presence, kindness, truth. Things money can't buy and power can't demand, and I'd forgotten they even existed." Her breath caught, but before she could reply, he waved her off lightly, almost embarrassed by his own admission. "Anyway, I just thought you should know." That night, Elena lay awake in her small apartment, listening to Luca's soft breathing beside her, and wondered what it meant. She had entered this building only to clean floors, yet somehow she had stepped into the heart of a man the world believed untouchable. And now he was changing, not into someone new, but perhaps into the man he had once been before the world hardened him. She was afraid of what it could mean, afraid of what paths it might open, but she also could not deny the quiet pride that stirred in her chest. The most striking sign of change came weeks later when Asher called Meredith into his office one morning. She braced herself, expecting some new battle plan for the company's recovery, some impossible demand for more hours and more results. Instead, he handed her a sealed envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "A donation," he replied simply. "To the Children's Innovation Fund. Set up a program for kids who want to build, to dream, engineering, science, art. Give them the tools I never had." Meredith blinked. It's a very large sum, Mr. Kane." He shrugged almost casually. "It's time my money boy tin dwelt more than walls." News of the donation spread quickly. Headlines shifted. Asher Kane funds youth program for dreamers. The press, always eager to pounce, tried to speculate on motives, but the gesture was too generous to dismiss. Parents wrote letters of gratitude, children sent drawings in the mail, and for the first time in decades, Asher Kane's name was spoken not only with fear or envy, but with admiration. Yet for Asher, the applause mattered little. What mattered was the look in Elena's eyes the next evening when she saw the article left on his desk. She said nothing, but her small, quiet smile told him everything. Still, beneath the transformation, doubts lingered. Asher knew he was walking unfamiliar ground. He had spent so long building a fortress of solitude that he scarcely knew how to live outside it. And though he felt drawn toward Elena in ways he could not ignore, he feared what it might mean for her, for Luca, for himself. Could a man who had devoted his life to power truly deserve a second chance at something as fragile, as human, as love? That question haunted him late at night, when the office was silent and the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Yet even then, when doubt pressed hardest, he would glance at the crayon airplanes still taped inside his shelf, and somehow the child's gift reminded him that even the heaviest hearts could learn to fly again. The man who had vanished into his office after Claire's departure was gone. In his place was someone the world scarcely recognized, A man who still commanded power, yes, but who had begun to rediscover his humanity. The man who came back was not the Ice King of Kane International. He was something far rarer, a man learning to be whole again. Tea at dawn. Daniel's hand froze on the rag he was holding, his eyes narrowing slightly in cautious surprise. Dinner? He repeated slowly, as if the word itself didn't fit neatly into his life. Yes, she said quickly, almost defensively. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a meal. My daughter would love it, and I'd like to thank you properly. He hesitated, the lines of weariness deepening around his eyes. Pride warred with practicality inside him. He wasn't a man who accepted favors easily, and the thought of stepping into her world, into a polished dining room filled with things he could never afford, made his chest tighten. Yet when he glanced down, he saw his own daughter's face alight with excitement. She was already tugging at his sleeve, whispering, "Please, Daddy, please say yes. I want to play with her again." Daniel sighed softly, defeated not by Ella's persistence but by the joy shining in his child's eyes. He looked back at Ella, his expression guarded but not unfriendly. "All right," he said finally. "Dinner." That evening, Ella opened her home to them. Her apartment, perched high above the city, glowed with soft light and modern elegance. Daniel looked slightly out of place as he stepped inside, his worn jacket hanging awkwardly over one arm, his boots squeaking faintly against the polished floors. But his daughter rushed in with wide eyes, marveling at the tall windows and the glittering skyline beyond. Lily Montgomery grabbed her hand instantly, dragging her toward a pile of toys, and within moments the two girls were laughing together as if they had shared a lifetime of secrets. Ella guided Daniel toward the dining table, set neatly with simple but elegant dishes. For a while the conversation was hesitant, filled with pauses and polite nods. But as the children's laughter filled the apartment, the walls between them began to thin. Ella asked about Uda's work at the garage, and he spoke with quiet pride about fixing cars, about the satisfaction of solving problems with his hands. She admitted that she had never so much as changed a tire, and they both laughed, the sound bridging the gap between their worlds. When dinner was served, the atmosphere softened further. The children sat side by side, giggling at inside jokes only they understood, while the adults slowly allowed themselves to relax. Ella found herself smiling more than she had in months, her shoulders loosening, her heart strangely lighter. For Daniel, the polished apartment and delicate dishes felt foreign, but Ella's warmth disarmed his discomfort. He realized she wasn't just the CEO he had imagined. Beneath the surface, she was a mother yearning for connection, just as he was. And then it happened. As dessert was served, Lily Montgomery leaned against Ella, her small hand resting trustingly on her arm. "Thanks, Mommy," she said sleepily, her voice carrying the innocence of a child lost in comfort. The room fell silent. Ella's breath caught, her eyes darting to Daniel, whose fork paused halfway to his mouth. His gaze was unreadable, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something he quickly masked. Ella's heart raced. She knew her daughter had spoken without thinking, guided only by the safety she felt in the moment. She should have corrected her, should have gently explained, but the word lingered in the air, heavy with possibility. For one brief, breathless second, she didn't want to correct her at all. Daniel cleared his throat, breaking the silence, and set his fork down. "It's getting late," he said softly, his tone even, but carrying a weight Ella couldn't decipher. He glanced at his daughter, who was already nodding sleepily, then back at Ella. "Thank you for dinner. It was nice."